Welcome to the Lawless Astrology channel. My name is Dabney and I'm an evolutionary astrologer. Today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the book The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe. And the book was written, I think, in the 90s or the early 2000s, I think in the 90s. And it is incredibly prophetic and it's incredibly interesting. And it matches up really well with the Uranian cycle. So I'm going to be talking about natural cycles with the planets. I'm going to be talking about history here in the United States. And I'm also going to be talking about the four turnings and the generations. So it was kind of a big undertaking. I've read the book. I've done a lot of research on the past 100 years, the past 84 years, Uranian cycle, what I think we can expect with this next one. So if that's content you're interested in, I hope you do stick around. I do want to give a little bit of a warning that if you are already feeling really out of balance or nervous about the future, this book is really kind of very direct in the fact that we are headed toward a crisis or we are already in a crisis. So just keep that in mind, protect yourselves. The bottom line is I think we can all look around and recognize that we are in the midst of a crisis, and I think we're hitting maximum crisis. And I'm hoping to look at what the astrology says about that and to give you a little bit forewarning. So again, if that's interesting to you, please stick around. I would love it if you like, subscribe, share. If this content really, fascinates you, tell other people about it. I'm excited. We've been growing this channel for the past, I believe I've been doing this now for 8 months, maybe 9, and we're growing. And so I want to keep growing. I want to keep helping people recognize that the cosmos can give us meaning down here on planet Earth. And as much as this book stressed me out, because I'm not gonna lie, it stressed me out a little bit, it also gave me meaning and helped me figure out, like, okay, these are cycles. This is destiny. This is something that's bigger than us. And once I kind of got that into my head and into my heart, then it's something I can keep coming back to, and I hope you can as well. So all right, let's dig in. So I have a lot to cover here, and like with all of my historical bigger videos, I do have notes, so you'll have to forgive me. I'm not so savvy as to have like a teleprompter or anything like that, because like I just said, I've only been doing this for a few months. But yes, the book is called The Fourth Turning, and let me just sort of outline the basics of the book before I get into the planetary energy. If you've not read this book, I do recommend it. It's a little repetitive at times. It could be edited down, but if you're a history buff and if you like kind of planetary cycles, they don't talk about planets here, but they do use some language that really does help me realize that they kind of do get the bigger picture of cycles. And that's what life is about. Life is about cycles. And one of the things they talk about in the book is that there are 3 kind of philosophies around life. One is that it's chaotic. Another that is that it's cyclical. And another is that it's linear. And so primitive man had this notion of it like it was a chaotic world. This is what they say in the book. And the more classical, medieval societies felt like it was more cyclical. And in the West, especially more modern life, we kind of think of it as linear, like things build on each other. And there's some truth to that, but the cyclical thing is very true. And I think we get to a point where we recognize, like, we feel like we're sort of invincible. We've had, and this, the book kind of illustrates how through the generations, there's these repeats of what the generations experience. And so the book goes back hundreds of years. It goes back to before the founding of the United States. It goes back to England. It is definitely centered on the West. And so that's what they're focusing on. They're not focusing on patterns, in Eastern history or, Asian history. This is very much a phenomenon that they identified in the West, and especially here in the United States, where we just kind of have this need to blow things up every 84 years and almost like start over again. So after there's a major crisis, they have what's called the high. And so this is a period following a crisis marked by strong institutions, civic unity, social order, and society prioritizes collective progress and stability. The most recent high was post-World War II era, late 1940s to 1960s. So then you have what's called the awakening, the second turning. And that's a period of spiritual and cultural upheaval where individualism challenges society's conformity. Institutions once revered are now questioned. The most recent awakening was the consciousness revolution in the early 60s to the 1980s. And that drove civil rights movement, counterculture, personal liberation. So, it's kind of like first you have this like we've just come through this major crisis and we're all sort of exhausted and we need to come together and rebuild society. And it's a little bit more of a conservative time, and it's a time where, things are a little bit more lawful and people aren't challenging norms. It's much more about what is, considered traditional society. And then afterwards, you get the awakening, which has to do with, wanting a little bit more freedom and testing boundaries and testing norms. And I'm going to be talking about the Uranian cycles that match up with this and kind of the years that it also kind of matches up with in a human life. So it's all kind of intertwined and really interesting, but I don't want it to be too confusing. So I'm going to try to make it as linear as possible. So after the awakening, you have the unraveling. And this is a time, and this is called the third turning. And this is a time of weakening institutions, growing individualism, society fragmentation, trust in government and national unity declines, culture wars intensify. And the most recent unraveling has occurred from the 1980s pretty much to about the 2010s. And this is marked by political polarization, deregulation, and a focus on personal freedom versus collective duty. So I think we can all sort of recognize that we've been in an unraveling for some time. Vast majority of my life has been this unraveling. Since I was a kid, things have started to unravel. And so now we are in the crisis, the fourth turning, which is a defining moment of upheaval where institutions collapse, are radically transformed, often through war, economic disaster, or revolution. This period reshapes the social and political landscape, setting the stage for a new high. The most recent fourth turning began around the 2008 Great Recession. That's what they say. Now, I actually think it starts a little bit later. I think it starts around 2010 when we have Citizens United, because I think that was kind of like the, final. That was kind of the end of the institutions really being able to protect us from outside money and a complete corporate oligarch takeover. So what's interesting is I heard about this book first in an article where someone named Steve Bannon was talking about it. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Steve Bannon, but he is one of he who shall not be named's top political advisors, especially in the first administration. And he's a right-wing podcaster now and felon. Anywho, I think maybe he's been pardoned now, but anyway, it's beside the point. I am not a fan of his, clearly, but I thought it was interesting and it piqued my interest when I first heard him talking about the fact that we have been in this unraveling and we're at a crisis now. And he is not someone that I admire, but potentially I can say that I have a certain degree of respect for the fact that he is a pretty astute political strategist. And he is somewhat nihilistic, and I don't agree with him. But I will say that his thinking of the blow it all up has a lot to do with his belief in this book and the fourth turning and what he saw as a collapse in society and collapse in our the fabric of our society, basically. So, I'm not going to go into my personal political opinions about that entirely, but okay, the next thing that's sort of interesting about this book is they talk about the reason we have these turnings is based on the archetypes of the generations and what happens with these particular generations when there has been a crisis and there has to be the rebuilding. And so there are 4 generations that he identifies. The prophets, which translates in the most recent one, the people that are alive today. So he goes back through history, or they both go back through history, and you can sort of see the correlates, and they have really good evidence for how this continues to manifest over and over again. But the prophets, what they call prophets, are the boomers. So the nomads are what I call Zoomers and Gen X. The heroes is the other archetype, and that's the millennials. And then the final one is the artists, who are Gen Z and Gen Alpha. So let me give a little bit of a description of each of those. And then let's talk about the Uranian cycles. So let's see, the prophets. So the prophets, that would be your boomers, your baby boomers, who were born after World War II and the Great Depression. So they were born into this high where there had just been this major cataclysmic event that completely annihilated the way that everything was done prior to it. And so then it was like, we have to have a new vision. And so this is the prophets, and the visionaries are born. And so they're born during a high, they come of age during an awakening or the second turning, and they become elders during the crisis. So their traits are ideological, values driven, passionate, but sometimes dogmatic. Their role in history as elders during a crisis, they push for moral and societal transformation. So previous prophet generations, you know, he talks about like the Civil War and all this stuff. So, but I want to keep it as simple as possible. So the nomads are the survivors and the pragmatists. They're the little bit more jaded generation, the Zoomers and the Gen Xers. And they're born during the awakening, the second turning. They come of age during the unraveling. Like I said, I'm Gen X, and I came of age during, most of my life really has been during the unraveling. And they're independent, cynical, pragmatic, tough, and resourceful. And their role in history is leaders during a crisis, and they provide practical hands-on leadership. Now, the heroes would be the builders and the warriors, and that's the millennials. And they're born during the unraveling, and they come of age during the crisis, and they're elders during the high. They're more civic-minded, team-oriented, confident, and self-sacrificing. And then you have the artists who are born during a crisis, and they come of age during the high, and they're elders during an awakening, and they're more sensitive, introspective, process-oriented, and risk-averse. So the prophets, again, you boomers out there who I know are my biggest audience, ignite cultural movements, setting up moral conflicts for the future. The nomads, my Gen Xers, navigate uncertainty, become hardened realists, because we definitely didn't have the kind of coddling of, our parents that previous generations had, or the generation that would come after us. We were kind of left on our own a lot of the time. And the heroes then rise to the challenge, rebuild society after a crisis. And they do have a lot more confidence than any other generation, because they were sort of raised by the prophets. And the artists help refine the new order and foster stability. So really interesting. Okay, so what does this have to do with astrology, Dabney? Good question, if that's what you're asking. I want to talk about Uranus. Uranus is a planet of change, and often Uranian cycles have a lot to do with what needs to be shaken up in society. So in our own lives, personal lives, we have personal Uranus transits. So let's just first talk about the personal. In one lifetime, you are going to potentially have one Uranian return. And that means that Uranus comes back to where it was when you were born. So that would take 84 years. That is the cycle of Uranus. So a human lifetime is around 84 years. But in that lifetime, you're going to have Uranus making contacts with itself in different ways. So in your lifetime, you have had a Uranus sextiling Uranus. You've had Uranus trining Uranus. You've had Uranus opposing your Uranus. You've had Uranus squaring your Uranus, and on and on and on. Okay. You can go visit an astrologer. You can read a book about it if you are not an astrologer to learn exactly what that means. But what I want to tell you is that when Uranus up in the sky activates your own personal Uranus in some way, it is a wake-up call. It is something that shakes you and says, hey, pay attention. You need to grow. You need to change. You need to evolve. And Uranian evolution tends to be a little bit faster than a Pluto transit. It can kind of just come out of nowhere and be something that spurs energy or just a need for freedom, a need to do something differently. Okay. So if we think about 84-year cycle in one human life, well, let's look at that collectively too. Because Uranus is one of the outer planets, it moves slowly. So it also affects the collective. We've talked about this with Pluto and Neptune. This is one of those planetary things that affects everyone. So when a planet moves into a new sign, there is a new energy. Right now, Uranus is in the sign of Taurus, and it has been since 2018. And so if you think back to 2018, what are a lot of the themes that we've all been working under? We've been working under Taurus themes about security. Where do we feel secure? Where do we need to be shaken in our security? Where do we need to be shaken up in our financial lives? Where do we need to be shaken up when it comes to taking care of the earth and the planet? Okay, so that's some of the collective energy that we've been working on with Pluto in the sign of Taurus. Uranus in the sign of Taurus. Come this summer, Uranus will be entering Gemini. So that's a big deal for the United States because the United States personal Uranus, so like the United States, like countries have charts. The United States has its natal Uranus in the United States Sibley chart at almost 9 degrees of Uranus. Okay, so what that means is that Uranus up in the sky is going to be activating the natal Uranus of the United States. So much the way we had a Pluto return, we're having a Uranus return starting. The exact timing is more like 2027, but we're already going to be feeling it as soon as Uranus goes into Gemini. All right, so one of the things that I wanted to sort of get out there is every time Uranus goes into Gemini, the United States has historically gone to war. And Nick Dagan Best has done a whole book about this, and there's a great astrology podcast episode about it that I can link below. So if you want to look at some of his research and his work, it's really outstanding, and I'm hoping to get him on this podcast as well, my YouTube show. But there are other astrologers talking about this as well. But when Uranus was in Gemini, we had the Revolutionary War, we had the Civil War, and we had World War II. So these were big, big defining wars in our country's history. The Revolutionary War obviously helped create the country and the Constitution and, you know, breaking away from England. And you can go back before that, and there was wars as well, right on cue. The Civil War shook the foundation of our country, which we really never fully healed from in a lot of ways, around slavery and around the South versus the North. And I mean, you all know what the Civil War is about. And then we had World War II. So all of these things coincided too with advances in technology, because Gemini also is all about inventions and new ideas, and also a bifurcation where suddenly you have to make a choice. So we have, in every single one of these other giant crises, giant wars, Uranus was in Taurus in the lead up. So it wasn't like everything was happy, smiley, and then all of a sudden Uranus went into Gemini and you went to war. During Uranus and Taurus, people are questioning their values. People are questioning their security. People are questioning and wanting answers. They want things to be different than they are. They want things to be more traditional. They want things to be more secure. They're scared. Okay, that's a very Taurus security. They don't, Uranus doesn't like to be in Taurus because Uranus wants forward motion. Taurus likes things to be stable. And so suddenly you have kind of these warring factions within a country, in the United States, where you have some people who really want the traditional ways. They don't want things to change. You have other people who are pushing forward, wanting change desperately. And the two just start to loggerheads. And what's funny is they each mirror one another's shadow. And sometimes, one side is very traditional and doesn't want change and really wants to be a wrecking ball. And then you see the flip of it too. And there's kind of they're not talking to each other. So suddenly Gemini comes, Uranus and Gemini comes, and it's like fresh ideas. And all of a sudden you have to make a choice. You have to say what side you're on. There's no more waffling. There's a crisis point. Okay. So, and that happens in our own personal lives too, where we have, a Uranian transit, and we can no longer just sit on the sidelines and hope that an issue will go away. So when, Uranus goes into Gemini, I the positive thing is I think we're going to see some really positive advances in society and technology, but we're also going, so just here's an example, okay? So, the Enlightenment happened during Uranus and Gemini. I wrote it down. There it is. Okay. The founding of NATO happened during Uranus and Gemini. Okay. But also the Salem witch trials happened during Uranus and Gemini. So it's like this sort of collective, you have a choice, right? Like you can do things fresh and new and differently and the progressive way, or you can do them in a much more regressive, fearful, blaming, argumentative way. Okay, so the first Uranus sextile, which coincides with the early teen years, has to do with a rebellion. So it happens around 14 years old in a person's life. So I'm talking about both in a person's life and in a country's life. So if we think about Uranus having its first sextile, which is an aspect to the United States natal chart, okay, the first sextile, so 14 years after the crisis, so during the high, right? You have the first rebellion, the taste of freedom. Who am I? Awareness begins, individuation. So this was some of the things that I found during the first Uranus sextile after World War II. So you boomers will know some of this stuff, right? Elvis was on Ed Sullivan, but they only showed him from the waist up because it was obscene. Allen Ginsberg's Howl was published in the UK and seized in the US as obscene. There was the Eisenhower Doctrine. Strom Thurmond performed a 24-hour filibuster against the Civil Rights Bill. On the Road was published. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was published. Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged was published, and West Side Story premiered. And then also there was a governor that called in the National Guard in Little Rock for the Little Rock Nine. So if you've seen those pictures of the poor little, Black children trying to go to school in the South, and there's like people yelling at them and stuff, that happened, right? So this is that first rebellion. That was the first Uranus sextile. All of this is coinciding with the high. This is kind of after World War II. So still kind of in that same thing, we have the second turning, all right? We have Uranus in the second quadrant having to do with rebellion, individuation, cultural upheaval. And that really is the first Uranus square. So that coincides with your early 20s in your personal life, but here about early 20 years after World War II. So you have challenges, frustrations, wanting to break free, wanting to feel special, and also kind of your first sense, like when you're in your 20s, you get this first sense of how the world really works, and it wasn't what you thought. And so that coincides in this country with 1963 to 1964. And you have George Wallace becoming governor of Alabama. You have Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. So, saying women shouldn't just be relegated to the kitchen. Medgar Evers was killed. Sam Cooke and his band were arrested for trying to stay at a whites-only hotel. So you start to get this challenging, like it's a square, so it's not easy. You have Beatlemania, okay? Next level music. Selma marches. Kennedy was assassinated. Malcolm Wright forms the Black Nationalist Party. You have the Civil Rights of 1964 signed into law, which was earth-shattering in this country. It was a big thing that was very controversial, but it ushered in tremendous progress. But you had race riots in Harlem. Barry Goldwater wins the nomination. Sam Cooke is killed, and the Vietnam War continues to escalate. Or begins to escalate really in earnest. So then you have the first Uranus trine, which coincides with your early 30s. And this is, so in your own personal life, this is more of a liberation, a breakthrough, rewards beginning to take hold, and freedom. So this happened in 1970. And so this is kind of the end of the high. And you have Earth Day was created, and the EPA was created, the Environmental Protection Act. OSHA was created. PBS begins, and the World Trade Center becomes the tallest building in the world. So there's kind of like in your early 30s, and the same with the country, like a little bit of a peak experience. Like, okay, we kind of got our act together. We know what's happened. We're cooking with gas. But then we start to get kind of a little bit of a weakening. So the first Uranus opposition coincides with the ages 42 to 46, which coincides often with a midlife crisis, seeing where you're not being true to yourself. So this would start to usher in potentially that third turning, which is the unraveling. So, you kind of like have this high where you're building things, and then you have the second turning, which is the awakening, which was kind of around the time of Kennedy. And you have, like I said, like Malcolm X, and you have, people testing boundaries, and they're saying like, this isn't right. We need to progress society. And now we, kind of get to a place where we have the Civil Rights Act. We have like environmental protections, and then suddenly, like, strangely enough, things start to unravel. And so, in your midlife crisis, it's a little bit more of a selfish time. The Uranus opposition is like, people kind of like joke about like the guy getting like the Corvette and like leaving his wife for like a 20-year-old, because he wants to feel young again, because he's suddenly feeling old. He's feeling his age. He's not understanding why he doesn't feel the way he used to feel, or she used to feel. Like, it's similar. Women, kind of go all half-cocked during their Uranus opposition. I know someone who left her family for another man during this time. People are looking to feel alive again, capture the good old days, romanticizing how things used to be, and not wanting to take responsibility. That's a big theme. And so here in the country, we have whole new set of things coming in the early 80s. In 1983, we have like MTV and new music, Michael Jackson's Thriller. We have this sort of romanticizing of traditional times. There's kind of like a throwback of people like really like idolizing the 1950s and like talking about poodle skirts again and things like that. NASA sends its first Black astronaut into space. Lots of space shuttle launches are happening in 1983. And the AIDS crisis accelerates. So you can kind of think of that as like, Reagan era is a little bit of like our midlife crisis. Like we think we're really all that. We're not old yet. We're still on top of the world. But things are starting to feel not the way they used to, right? That's the Make America Great Again. Like, Reagan used to say that. So there was already this like missing of how things used to be, a romanticizing. So also coinciding with this unraveling, we have the second Uranus trine, which in a human life would coincide with about 60 years old. Okay, so here you are at peak authority. You have made your money. You've had your children. Like, you've gone through your second Saturn return and you know who you are. You're not sort of feeling that like, oh, I wish I was young, trying to hold on to it in the same way that you were during the opposition. You have a little bit more confidence. And in 1998 is when this coincided in the United States, and it was the Clinton-Monica Lewinsky scandal. Like that, I was looking like what happened that year. And like nothing else mattered that year because it was all like we were bored. Like it's just dumb drama, but also it's kind of this like cockiness. Like we got like, oh, try to catch me, catch me if you can. Well, you got caught. You lied. Like now here we are. Like talk about So the Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton scandal really dominated the headlines in everybody's life during that time. There wasn't much else that was going on in 1998 in the news, at least. Forgive me if I'm missing something that I can't remember, but it was pretty much when I went back and looked. That was the headlines. So then we have the second Uranus square, which is going to be more challenging than that trine. And that coincides with ages 62 to 65 in our human lives. And that brings in new challenges and new frustrations and wanting to break free, but you're more mature than the first time. So the first time, you have the Uranus square, you're young and you are rebellious, but like you want change and you want progress. And now when you're 62 to 65, you're a little bit more jaded. You know how the world works. So it's a different kind of wanting to break free. And it also still feels challenging. Like you want something to change, but you don't necessarily know if it can. Okay, so here are the things that happened in 2005 to 2006. So, and you can see that it's much more, it's not the silliness of like a president having an affair. Which was very serious at the time, but like the disproportionate amount of news and the quote unquote family values people who, now have all sorts of other fresh ideas about that. But anyway, 2005 to 2006, we had Hurricane Katrina. We had the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in full swing. We had 150 protesters go to DC to protest the Iraq war. People forget there were progressive people protesting, myself included, the Iraq war. There were. And it was not a Democrat war. So we may have owned it, but we shouldn't. Tom DeLay, a Republican, the Republican House leader, indicted on criminal conspiracy charges. Cracks in the housing bubble begin to emerge. Lance Armstrong and baseball players make history as they are super juiced up on steroids. John Roberts and Sam Alito are appointed to the Supreme Court. The Abu Ghraib atrocities and torture scandal comes out. Scooter Libby scandal about CIA retribution leak comes out. And the U.S. prison population soars to 2.5 million after the Clinton and Bush era tough on crime laws. So really, really like in a fast amount of time, the prison population doubled. So this is all kind of that push and pull. But again, the country's more jaded. It's different. It's not the youthful progress. But there still is kind of these race relation issues. There's corruption issues. There's issues around climate change emerging. So like the housing bubble thing starts to emerge. So like you start to really feel that during this unraveling, this is the beginning of the real unraveling. So then we have the fourth turning, which is the crisis era. And that, coincides with your second Uranus sextile around 70 years old. This is the second rebellion. It's freedom now, not caring as much what other people think. There's a new level of boldness and individuation when you're that age. Like you literally just don't care anymore. You've survived this long and you know yourself and you're kind of like, yeah, I want it to be this way. I've seen it. I've seen it with my clients, and I've also seen their level of self-knowledge. So, a really positive expression of that is just authenticity and, still being careful and kind to other people. But a less evolved expression of that is kind of more that just rebellious new level of boldness and individuation that almost borders on selfishness. And so in the country, that coincides with 2013 to 2014, where we are fully entered into the crisis. And so we have the Supreme Court overturns the 5-4 decision, overturns part of the Voting Rights Act. So that was a pretty big deal at the time. George Zimmerman was arrested for killing Trayvon Martin and was later fully acquitted. So that George Zimmerman case was a very big initial, are we going to care about a white man just killing a young unarmed black man? Do we care? That was, some people, I guess, said no. Immigration and climate change issues really accelerate. They're at the forefront. No, this is the Obama years. And so minimum wage is raised. VA funding is insured or assured. They funded the VA more. There's a lot of other progressive policies that are instituted. Obamacare really kicks in for the first time. But there's, these things were kind of little. People didn't pay very much attention because there were all these culture wars over gay marriage, marijuana legalization, net neutrality, taxes, the Affordable Care Act. Gay marriage became like a real lightning rod, racism, just so many things at the forefront. And this is when we start to also, because we all have these cell phones in our hands, this is when people start to record police brutality for the first time. So people are confronted with the African American experience in a way that they hadn't before, that they weren't able to see. And so the next big thing that we have is the Uranus return, which is the 84-year cycle. And that's the maximum crisis. That's where it really hits a maximum crisis point. And in your own life, that's pure Uranian energy. There is kind of something new. If you make it to 84 and you're in good health, it's almost like you've kind of crossed over this threshold. You see a lot of people that live to be 100 because it's like they've got this newfound energy. Their bodies may still be struggling, but it's like they got to this Uranian point and now they're going to start the new cycle. So it's really, it's really interesting to watch in a human lifetime. So the Uranus cycle aligns with the fourth turning martel, marking distinct periods of institutional rise, cultural awakening, decline, and crisis every 84 years. Uranus completes a cycle, syncing with the generational rhythms that Strauss and Howe describe. So the current Uranus placement of Taurus Gemini suggests that this first turn, what we talked about, we're in the thick of it. Okay. So, all right, I hope that all made sense. So now I want to kind of break down some other stuff, and I want to read some passages here if you want to stick around for that. I don't want to freak anybody out, but we have to understand that there is something to the fact that there are natural cycles in life. So we have these cycles in our personal life, we have these cycles in our country. And I hope that I illustrated how they kind of match up, right? Like being a teenager and, loving Elvis and, being in your early 20s and like wanting to, make the world a better place and, being in your early 40s and like just wanting your youth back. And so, these cycles coincide. And what you see is a lot of the people alive today are not people that were necessarily alive. A lot of during World War II and the Depression, a lot of those people have passed over. And there's a few examples, obviously, but like I know everyone in my family that was alive during the Depression and World War II are no longer alive. And so what happens is people start to lose their memory of how bad things can be. And this happened with the Civil War because then 84 years later, they had World War II. And it happened with the Civil War because they forgot about the Revolutionary War. So, and before that was the War of the Roses in the UK. So it's like this new generation needs to experience all of this in life and who you are and what, the boundaries that you push. I mean, you boomers like really have, written the script for where we are in a lot of ways. But that's how it was the cycle before. Your generation coincided with the GI. I don't remember what that was your parents. Anyway, the book talks about it. So I didn't write it all down. But I did want to read some cool quotes that I pulled out. Sometime before, this is actual quotes in the book that I think will, kind of give you some ideas about where we are here in the crisis. Oh, I also wanted to say that if you're looking for timing, what do I think is going to happen? Do I think we're headed to a big bloody war like, World War II? I can't predict that future. Do I think we are in a crisis? Absolutely. I mean, come on. And has it reached maximum crisis? I believe so. I think we are like really on the precipice. Uranus is going into Gemini this summer. It will be exactly the Uranian return, and I'll probably do another video next year or in a while, I don't know, a few months, about the actual United States Uranian return specifically and the patterns there. Christopher Renstrom has some cool stuff that he kind of mentioned about that. But, and I'm also going to have Rick Levine on soon. And so I can talk to him a little about the Uranian return for the United States, because I think that's just like the Pluto return was a big deal. This will also be a big deal, but have a different flavor, and it will progress us forward. So, how long do I think this will last? So I know everybody wants me to say that in a few months, everything's going to be great. I kind of don't think that's the case. I think we're going to have a new high. When do I think the crisis will be over? I think we've got at least 5 or 7 years before the actual full crisis is over. And will that be a world war? Will it be a revolution? Will it be a billionaire reckoning? Will it be all of those? Possibly. I think as we get closer and we feel the energy, obviously we're going to know more as things are unfolding, but clearly our country's infrastructure of government is crumbling. And there is a degree of lawlessness right now, and there's an oligarchic overtaking, and nobody seems to be really effectively standing up and saying no more. So I do see, the courts are trying, but what's going to happen when things get to the Supreme Court, I can't say, and the seeds have been planted during the previous turnings. So, during that unraveling, we have people that were put into place that are there now for the crisis that are, I don't necessarily think wanting to get back to norms. Like, I don't know. So we'll see. I mean, he who shall not be named got presidential immunity for whatever the hell he wants. So, and most people said that would never happen. So I think we're at a very there is no, that would never happen. And what do I think the solution is going to be? I think it's going to be very Pluto and Aquarius, which is going to be people in the streets. I'm not advocating for anything. This is for entertainment purposes only. I don't have a crystal ball. This is just somebody who looks at historical patterns, who read a book, who likes astrology, and is trying to communicate to y'all what I think might happen. And the good news, okay, so I don't want to freak everybody out and feel like there's no hope. And part of me did feel a little freaked out when I read the book. So don't read it if you don't want to get a little freaked out. But oh my God, do they call it? They call so many things that their prophecy. It's called an American prophecy. Like I said, it was written in the 90s. They were here's some crisis things that could happen. You could have a pandemic, and you could have a coup or an authoritarian leader emerge. They just call it. They just, you could have a financial crisis where people lose their homes. It was just prophetic, right? They call it a prophecy. So that's why I wanted to write down some of these quotes that I liked, that I thought could give us some more context and could be interesting if you don't want to read the whole book. So, sometime before the year 2025, America will pass through a great gate in history, commiserate with the American Revolution, Civil War, and the twin emergencies of the Great Depression and World War II. The risk of catastrophe will be very high. The nation could erupt into insurrection or civil violence, or crack up geographically, or succumb to authoritarian rule. So, that is a little bit where we're at. Again, the good news, I didn't get to the good news. Here's the good news. There's an end. It does end. And I'm not even saying that it has to be 5 or 7 years. That was just my best guess, okay? There is an end. There is a new high. There's an emerging, just like there was from past crises. Sometimes these crises come just as floods replenish the soils and fires rejuvenate the forest. A fourth turning clears out society's exhausted elements and creates an opportunity for fresh growth. Over the millennia, man has developed 3 ways of thinking. So we talked a little bit about that. There's a mysterious cycle. This was a quote from FDR. There's a mysterious cycle in human events. To some generations, much is given. Other generations, much is expected. This generation has a rendezvous with destiny. So, I don't need to keep going on. I think you get the point. But we are in a crisis. This book is fascinating. And I think you can see that basically this book mirrors astrology. And so no matter what is your way of making sense of life, that's what we're doing right now. We need to make sense of all of this. And if we can kind of calm ourselves, and that's the calming part, that's the not catastrophizing part, and recognize this is an unfolding, this is a rejuvenation, this is a cycle of life, just like the forests that have to burn in order for new growth to come up. There is something to be said about this. And if you subscribe to any kind of philosophies around, a lot of Eastern religions and, Buddhism, we have to have different experiences in order to achieve any kind of enlightenment or to have your soul's evolution and your soul's growth. We have to experience what it's like to be in these crisis times. And so in these crisis times, maybe we each have to be part of the prophet, the nomad, the hero, and the artist. Maybe we have to have the point of view of the children that were the nomad children that maybe were not protected in the same way. The nomad children line up with Gen X, but they also line up with the lost generation. And in the book, they talk about how George Burns was completely neglected and was in the saloon doing dances to make money for food. because parents were off doing something else, right? So there's this kind of generational cycles too that manifest in these crises. So anyway, it's a Uranian thing. And I'm going to have a lot more to say about Uranus in Gemini. I would love to hear your thoughts about this. If you've read this book, what you think about it. There is a new book out that it's only a couple years old. I think I did not read that book, but it's called like The Fourth Turning is Here, or The Crisis is Here, or something like that. So if you've read that book and you have any insights, please share below in the comments. But this is really astrology. So, this is mirroring the human experience and a human lifetime. And if we kind of consider the United States is kind of going through this, like, it needs something new. It's time for that 84-year-old Uranian return. Like, are we going to be, feisty and fresh and new afterwards? Or is something, or is this our time for what we had to wrap up, so then something feisty, fresh, and new can be born? So, okay, yeah. So there is a reason and a season for it all. The cosmos is conspiring to help us. It's no secret that we are in crisis times, but you are not alone. We're all in it together, and this is just another way to make sense of it all. So until next time, stargazers, thanks for taking the journey with me.